Trolley to Yesterday by John Bellairs, Chapter 12. Fergie, Johnny, and the professor stared. They were utterly flabbergasted. "Holy Mother Machree!" exclaimed the professor. "What on earth does that fool think he's doing? Come on, we've got to stop him before he gets himself killed." As Fergie and Johnny watched in horror, the professor bolted out of the clump of trees and began running toward Mr. Townsend. After glancing quickly at each other, the two boys began running too. There didn't seem to be anything else they could do. For an old man, the professor could really scoot. Fergie caught up to him first, and he saw that the professor was holding Mr. Townsend by the arm and talking to him rapidly. The sword and the valise were lying on the ground nearby. "And we're going to get back to the trees," the professor was saying as Fergie drew near. "The whole Turkish army is out there, and pretty soon they'll see us, if they haven't done so already. Come on, we have to go back." Mr. Townsend glowered at the professor. He set his feet stubbornly and refused to move. "Take your hands off me," he said haughtily as he tried to shake his arm free from the professor's grip. "I am an admiral of Venice. The Emperor of Byzantium needs me, and I am going to his aid. I found an enchanted sword in this bag of enchanted objects in a half-ruined church near here. With these weapons, we'll beat back the enemy. I order you to let me go. If you do not, the wrath of Venice will fall on your head." Once again, Mr. Townsend tried to wriggle free, but the professor's grip was like iron. He would not let go. As Mr. Townsend struggled, the professor turned and glanced helplessly at Fergie. "We've got a real problem on our hands, Byron," he said. "Townsend has taken a nasty blow to the head, and now he thinks he really is a Venetian admiral. I don't know what we are going to do, but we can't let him run off to his death. Thank God he brought the valise and sword along. We might need them later on." Fergie looked at into Mr. Townsend's eyes, and he saw that they were bleary. Under the rim of his hat was a red, sticky mass of blood and hair. "Oh, great," muttered Fergie disgustedly. "Just great. All we need now is somebody who's out of his jug. Here comes John. I think the four of us are going to catch it, but good." Johnny ran huffing and puffing up to the other tree. When the professor explained the situation to him, he was silent. Something like panic was growing in his mind. Were they going to get out of this alive? It didn't seem likely. Suddenly, in the distance, a wild yelling began. Trumpets brayed and drums boomed. A great mob of turbaned soldiers was moving toward them across the grassy plain. Banners waved in the breeze, and the morning sun glittered on a forest of spears and cruel curved swords. The professor's hand flew to his mouth. "Oh, my God!" he gasped. "It's the Turkish army. They're attacking, and we can't go back to the well because we're cut off. Come on, boys. We've got to reach the city walls before they do. It's our only chance. Run!" Letting go of Mr. Townsend's arm, the professor scooped up the sword and the valise. Then he began galloping madly toward the city walls. The boys pounded along behind him, and Mr. Townsend just stood there, glancing vaguely around, while the huge mob of soldiers got nearer. As he ran, Johnny looked behind him once or twice, and each time he saw Mr. Townsend standing like a tree in the middle of the grassy field. On and on the three of them ran. They ran harder and faster than they had ever imagined they could, and the roaring army swept forward, a horrible human tidal wave like some huge object seen in a nightmare. The walls of Constantinople loomed closer and closer. All around them, Johnny saw the wreckage left by the earlier attacks the Turkish army had made. Broken spears, an overturned wooden tower on wheels, and dead bodies. Mercifully, Johnny did not have time to stop and stare at these things. He was too busy running for his life. The three of them raced while the frightful, roaring soldiers got nearer and nearer. Once Johnny stumbled, but the professor immediately picked him up and hurried him on his way. If they reached a gate, would the people of Constantinople let them in, or would they think they were part of the attacking army? There was no time to think, only time to run, and as Johnny looked ahead through his fog glasses, he saw another great wrecked siege tower. These tall wooden structures had been built so that the Turkish soldiers could climb up them and jump out onto the top of the city's walls. The defenders had sneaked out at night to burn this one, and it was just a mass of charred timbers. But why were they running toward it? Were they going to hide behind it? The professor was yelling to the boys, but his voice was lost in all the loud noise that filled the air. Johnny saw a pit before him. He tried to stop, but the professor gave him a shove, and he went in head first, sliding and rolling down a long ramp of earth. Fergie came hurtling down after him, bumping Johnny to one side. Finally, the professor jumped, bouncing along on his rear, with the sword in one hand and the valise in the other. At the bottom of the pit, Johnny closed his eyes and curled up in a ball. Any minute now, soldiers would jump down into the pit and kill him. As he waited tensely, the yelling and braying of horns grew deafeningly loud, and then it died away. The army had gone on past. "Holy H-smoke!" sighed the professor as he wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "That was a close one. I thought those maniacs were going to turn us into chopped steak. Fortunately, we found the entrance to a mine." Johnny opened his eyes and sat up. They were squatting at the bottom of a deep shaft, but straight ahead the entrance to a low tunnel gaped. "Mine?" Johnny said in a puzzled voice. "What kind of mine?" Fergie understood and grinned. "Oh, come on, John, baby," he said mockingly. "You've forgotten everything you ever read. This is one of those tunnels they dug under the walls of the city during a siege. They stick in barrels of gunpowder and blow the walls sky high." Johnny's fogged brain was slowly beginning to clear. "Oh, yeah," he said uncertainly. "Sure, I remember now. So what are we going to do now? Hide down here till it gets dark?" The professor sighed and scratched the end of his nose. "We could do that," he said thoughtfully, "but it would be risky. Sooner or later, some Turkish soldier is going to come poking down this hole. And then goodbye to us. And even if that doesn't happen, we'd have to crawl back out and try to make our way past a lot of soldiers in order to get to the seacoast again. Even in the dark, we might be spotted. And remember, we don't have a compass with us." "Well then, like John was saying, what are we going to do?" asked Fergie grumpily. "Spend the rest of our lives down in this hole?" The professor glared testily at Fergie. "No, we are not. I think we ought to see where this tunnel leads. If we get lucky, it might take us inside the walls of the city. From there, we might find our way down to the docks in a ship that will take us back to Leander's Tower. And please don't get worried and think that I'll try to save the city with my flare gun. I just want to get us back to Dunstan Heights in one piece." "That's a relief, I must say," rasped Brewster, who had suddenly appeared in the darkness at the bottom of the pit. "This is definitely not a time for cheap heroics and daredevil stuff." "Thank you for your expert advice," growled the professor. "Would you care to lead the way?" "I'll do what I can," said Brewster, "though it does seem to me that we have been spending a great deal of time underground." They began to crawl down the low tunnel on their hands and knees. Brewster went first, casting a pinkish glow on the dark earthen walls. Then came the professor, shoving the satchel in front of him. Johnny clumped along next, with the professor's sword clutched awkwardly in one hand. Last came Fergie, with his switchblade knife held tight in his teeth. They crept on through the darkness, with only Brewster's pale glow for a guide. Finally, they came to a place where the tunnel ended. It was a little room with dirt walls, a hollowed-out space where all of them could crouch together side by side. Overhead, they saw the heavy foundation stones of the mighty wall, and in one corner, 3 small wooden barrels. A small hole had been punched in the top of one, and a trail of black grains ran down the side of the barrel and across the floor. Johnny glanced nervously up at the heavy stones that seemed to hang perilously over his head. "Which wall do you think this is, Professor?" he asked timidly. The professor squinted. "I'd say it was the inner set of walls. They're the strongest and the thickest, and those stones up there are very, very thick. I wonder why those barrels of gunpowder were never touched off. Maybe they lighted the trail of powder at the other end of the tunnel, and some dirt fell onto the powder halfway along and put out the fire. Well, I wonder if there is a way out of this end of the tunnel." Taking the sword from Johnny, the professor hacked at the wall of the little room. In one place he found nothing but more dirt, but when he dug into the left-hand wall, the point of the sword struck something hard. Working quickly, the professor cleared a space about a foot wide, and the boys saw a row of smaller stones that were held in place by mortar. With his mouth screwed into a stubborn frown, the professor hacked at the mortar until one of the stones was ready to come out. He pulled at it, and it moved easily. The mortar was crumbly and old. Beyond the stone was blackness and a heavy smell of mold. And that's the end of Chapter 12.